I don't know about you, but when I was sitting in our Easter service this Sunday, I could not help but think about the chapter we've just been reading. Um, Denny, you weren't there, were you? You were staying home because of COVID.
I was there on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I have a little bit of a but well, some hesitation in teaching this because, because like Denny says, we're eating forbidden fruit that has been forbidden for quite some time, so much so that these texts have been destroyed by the so-called Orthodox Church. I say so-called because we're learning more and more that uh, Orthodoxy has really become a constructed reality. I think the most surprising thing to most people is that when we talk about the Gospels, we just assume there were only four Gospels, or people tend to assume there were only four Gospels. But what we're learning now is that by the middle of the second century, there were so many Gospels, at least 25. I don't have an exact number, but uh, some that we know of, some that have been lost. But there was a very concerted effort to make sure that there were insiders and outsiders. And as we know, the insider gospels were four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it was about 170 or so that a man by the name of Irenaeus proposed that these four be the primary gospel. I mean, the exclusive gospels, not just primary, the only ones that are being read. And this because, well, for several reasons, but the primary one was that Irenaeus wanted to have some means by which the church, which was starting to expand across, the known Roman Empire, did not end up in a tangled mess with one church in Alexandria saying one thing about Jesus and another church, let's say in Lyon, saying something different about Jesus. So he said the first way to begin is to ensure that we're all reading the same gospels. Well, that's all well and good, but how do you decide what gospels are authentic? And for Irenaeus, and I think you will probably recognize this, he kind of came up with an arbitrary, which appears to be an arbitrary criterion, and that is those gospels that have been written from the hand or from the tradition of people who were in the presence of Jesus and knew him bodily and witnessed his bodily resurrection and witnessed his bodily ascension into heaven. And this becomes uh, really the sole criterion by which these gospels, or by which the authority of the gospels is recognized. So we have Matthew and Mark, Luke and John. Now, the irony of that is that Matthew and John are considered to be two of Jesus' disciples, but Mark and Luke, I mean, if you read that list of disciples, they're not in the original 12. They're not in the 12. Mark is purported to have been a personal secretary for Matthew, and therefore writes his gospel from the perspective of his understanding of Jesus that he had. Um, there's a really interesting story in the Gospel of Mark that doesn't appear anywhere else, and this is when Jesus comes to be arrested. There's a young man who gets in a scuffle with one of the temple authorities and runs off into the dark naked. It's like, well, where's that come from? I mean, why is not in any of the other gospels? Well, scholars have said that this is, a very exclusive and specific experience that the author Mark had at that time. So Mark was present, so the tradition says. Well, this has the effect of, as we've come to see, this criterion that those who witness the bodily resurrection of Jesus, who touched his, his body and who were with him during his teaching and saw him afterwards, they become the central authorities. And we know that their number is 12. One of those was, killed himself or committed suicide and was replaced by a man named Matthias. But among those 12, the person who rises to the top in terms of his authority was Peter, uh, Peter the fisherman. And we know this from Matthew 16, and Peter, on you I shall build my church. You're the rock on which I'll build my church. In the story of Peter, having a conversation with John, excuse me, Peter having a conversation with Jesus. Um, Jesus says, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. So designating Peter as that apostle. But here's the interesting thing. The very first person to see Jesus bodily was Mary Magdalene, right? I mean, Jesus could have appeared to anybody. And, think about the fortitude of Mary. While the apostles are off, you know, hiding for fear of, their own lives, Mary is in the garden even before it's light out. You might remember that Greg emphasized that in his sermon this Sunday. Even before it's light, Mary is in the garden and she encounters Jesus, and Jesus says, very interesting story. He, she encounters the man and does not recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener, and and she says, if you've taken away my Lord, please let me know where he is so I can, take care of him. And the man says, Mary. And all of a sudden, Mary hears and sees that it's Jesus. And I've always thought it was very interesting because, we know that the word becomes flesh in the Gospel of John. But here in this situation, the flesh becomes word, right? The flesh is not recognized until it becomes the word spoken to Mary. But this would seem to instill or to recognize that Mary, being the very first person to see the bodily Jesus alive, resurrected, would have some authority herself. And part of the politics of bodily resurrection in the early church uh, had this caveat in their criterion. It's only the 12 men, not the women. So right from the start, this inclusive group of disciples that Jesus had is starting to be separated into the higher and the lower, and Mary is the one who's left out. This, however, begins a tradition in the Gnostic church that Mary was the one who was closest to Jesus. And there's an interpretation in the Gospel of John. We hear about the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. In fact, in the passage we heard this Sunday, Mary goes to the disciples and says, hey, the tomb's empty. No one's there. And Peter and the beloved disciple, they're on a foot race, right? They are hightailing it to that tomb. And it says in the gospel that the beloved disciple got there first, right? Like kind of giving a indication that the beloved disciple is really more primary than Peter was. Um, but eventually they recognize the tomb is empty, and then they have their own experience of Jesus' resurrection, their bodily resurrection. And that imputes to them, according to this later tradition, this authority that their gospels, the stories that are coming from their mouths, should be seen as authoritative. But what I was about to say is that Mary's meeting with Jesus, Mary Magdalene, in the garden, lends to her a certain amount of authority as well that the Gnostics are going to pick up on. In fact, there is a Gospel of Mary told from the perspective of Mary. And a tradition develops, and there's a reference to this in the Gospel of Thomas, which is accessible and you can read it. I think you can even get it online now. Not buy it, but just read the text. There's a tradition in the Gospel of Thomas that Mary was the beloved disciple. Mary was the one who was most intimate with Jesus. In fact, so intimate that Jesus kissed her on the, and then there's this blank space in the text. We don't know what it says, right? It's almost like somebody tried to erase it out, but it's assumed that it meant kissed her on the mouth, meaning, there was an intimacy there. Well, that kind of intimacy between Jesus and Mary is going to lend volumes of credibility to anybody who suggests that their tradition comes from the person who was most intimate, and you might even suggest physically intimate with Jesus himself. So there is a politics, there's a gender politics that's happening here as well. The Gnostics are going to be much more open. Not all, not there are a variety of Gnostic groups, but most Gnostics are going to be open to this idea of the egalitarianism that Jesus can appear to anybody regardless of gender. In the Orthodox Church, the authority of, the apostles also carries with it this presumed authority of maleness over femaleness. And we see that carried out throughout the Roman Catholic Church over the next ensuing centuries. So let me stop there and see if you have any questions about this so far.
Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, go ahead, Constance.
Um, this beloved apostle, I guess I was always reading that as John himself. Um,
Oh, you mean the beloved, the
right.
beloved disciple? Yes. It's assumed that it's John, but there is a tradition that that Mary was actually the beloved disciple. In fact, this is the whole basis of uh, what is Dan Brown's um, the Da Vinci Code.
Okay.
Um, there's a tradition that even Mary had a child, right, by Jesus, and this child becomes the so-called Holy Grail, the symbolic Holy Grail. All of these traditions that Mary was a, I don't know if you've ever seen an icon of the Virgin Mary, not, I'm sorry, excuse me, an icon of Mary Magdalene, but it's Mary Magdalene holding an egg, and it's usually a red egg. Yeah, check it out. Go to Google, holding an egg. And the story goes is that Mary went to France
Oh,
evangelizing and was preaching the resurrection of the body. And the king that she was preaching to said, "Oh, there's about as much chance of a human body being resurrected as there is for this chicken's egg to turn red." And Mary holds up this chicken egg that is red. And so, you know, this supposedly is a tradition of the Easter eggs that carries with it also this idea of fertility and so many of the feminine symbols that kind of get washed away out of yeah, Orthodox Christianity. Um, so anyway, yes, the beloved disciple is recognized as John, but there is another tradition that secretly, and this is where we get the Gnostic thing, right? John is really just a pseudonym for Mary Magdalene, and this story comes from Mary herself. So that makes sense, Constance?
yeah, it does. And it's funny because I was just reading about the monastery where she supposedly went, where the three Marys land on the coast of France, and then she goes off to this monastery.
The three Marys being Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary, who was there at the crucifixion. I think there are so many Marys or Miriams, and okay. Anybody else have a comment about this?
Dan, here it is. may have played a very shrewd card here in seeing that certainty and the need for miracles was very important for the commoners who needed something way beyond, their humble and probably nasty lives uh,
Right.
to believe in. And the
Mm.
Gnostics, the Gnostics are kind of saying, Jesus was, pretty much a human being, and kind of like you and me. And
Yeah.
that's not very elevating if you're trying to, sell that as a defining characteristic of this new religious institution.
Right. Right. And, there could be a kind of a socioeconomic aspect to this as well. Even in our society today, those who tend to be drawn to the excuse me, drawn to the miraculous tend to be of the lower socioeconomic caste. I think of my experience in Appalachia. Everybody was going for special healings, laying on of hands, carrying snakes, things like that. Um, there was not one person there who was not, you know, scraping by day to day, right? Um, but then look at the Episcopal Church or look at the Presbyterian Church. We middle class, we have the luxury to be able to think about a much more symbolic reading of the Gospels. And I wonder if this was the case in the first century as well. You had Jews who would naturally want to think of the resurrection of the body because that's the only way you could be a human being, right? But you also had Greeks as well. And I would say the Gnostic Gospels are a consequence of an upper class or a higher socioeconomic class of people who have access to the philosophy of Plato and the philosophy, the philosophies of the Greeks that usually feature some form of transcendence as the true reality. Think of Plato's forms or ideas. And so there's that aspect to it. There's no way that we can know this, right? Because the Gnostic Gospels themselves are usually attributed to um, some disciple of Jesus, whether it's Mary or James, the brother of Jesus, or Thomas, the twin. Uh, they're always writing in the spirit of that person. And so, we tend to think that this is happening in the Jewish community in Judea. Uh, but where were these Gnostic Gospels found? They were found in Nag Hammadi, right? They were found in Alexandria, Egypt, and that was probably one of the most intellectual regions of the world apart from Rome, right? And so you've got that aspect, the socioeconomic aspect as well. You want to respond to that, Denny? Or
Oh, I think that's well put.
oh, thank. Any other comments about this, Mac?
Yeah, I don't want to lose track of the fact that when we talk about the authorship of the Gospels, I know traditionally they were the disciples, but correct me if I'm wrong, but modern scholarship pretty much has ruled that out, hasn't it? Because just the dating of them, it would be
Yeah.
impossible. And for example, John, I think modern scholarship would
Darn.
more
Mac,
than
we
one
lost.
author probably put her to be eyewitness accounts.
Mac, we lost you a little bit, but I think what you were saying is something that I am going to show you in a minute here, and that is a quote from the book itself. And you're jumping ahead, yeah, let's not lose, but you have been the person who's recognized this right from the very beginning. Pagels is writing well before any of this Jesus seminar stuff has, really hit common knowledge, right? And this is her comment towards the end of chapter 1. What proves the validity of the four gospels, Irenaeus says, right? And it's on page 17, is that they actually were written by Jesus' own disciples and their followers who personally witnessed the events they described. And here's what I was thinking. This is why I put this on here, Mac, because I was thinking of you. Some contemporary biblical scholars have challenged this view. Few today believe that contemporaries of Jesus actually wrote the New Testament Gospels. We know virtually nothing about the persons who wrote the Gospels we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So what we know today, I mean, the primary criterion that was used, like, association with Jesus and witness of the bodily resurrection, we know today that the Gospels were written well after, the fact of Jesus' resurrection, or if you want to, the fact of Jesus' life. And the people who wrote them were probably not witnesses, Well, and think about the pseudo-Pauline epistles, right? People who are writing in the spirit of Paul, we're okay to give legitimacy to that, right? But what Pagels is basically saying here, that all of this falls apart. This whole idea that you can actually establish credibility on the fact that these gospel writers were firsthand observers of Jesus. That's just not the case. We just know that not to be the case these days. And I'm sorry, I got to get back to where I was going. You cut out a little bit on us when you were saying that, and I just wondered if that pretty much summarizes your point.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, good. Also, the people who have legitimate authority witness the ascension, and the understanding is that after this experience of the ascension, all experiences of Jesus, or all claims to authority, are going to have a lesser value. And so the assumption would be that Paul's letters, because Paul did not witness Jesus alive when Jesus lived, would have a lesser authority than the Gospels. But we know today that that's really not the case at all. Paul's letters almost have more authority than the Gospels when it comes to, well, when we look at the Nicene Creed, and how much theology was established on Paul's experience of Jesus. So all of this does fall apart, but look at what Irenaeus is trying to do. He's living in the middle of the 2nd century. The Roman Empire is starting to fray at the edges. The churches are starting to expand into various parts of the world, whether it's into Egypt or all the way over into Gaul, or in Palestine. How are we going to make sure that this church doesn't just fall apart by virtue of entropy? Everybody just saying different things. We need to unify. We need to come together. And so he establishes this criterion that's on page 10. His theory bears enormous implications for the political structure of the community. First, as the German scholar Karl Hohl has pointed out, it restricts the circle of leadership to a small band of persons whose members stand in a position of incontestable authority. Second, it suggests that only the apostles had the right to ordain future leaders as their successors. So now we have the foundation for the whole apostolic succession. That's so important, that the Pope today, or even in the Protestant tradition, Greg today, has being ordained, stands in a long line that goes all the way back to the original apostles. That laying on of hands was a tradition that carries through 20 centuries or so. Well, naturally, the Gnostics reject all of this. And they kind of make fun of it, right? It's just, you know, body coming back to life. I don't think that's that's ever going to happen. Nobody has witnessed that. And even uh, the references in the Gospels. There's a place in Matthew where it says that the graves are opened and people are walking through the streets. These dead people are being resurrected, and everybody's witnessing it, right? And the Gnostics are saying, no, that didn't happen. They're rejecting this idea that resurrection has to be bodily. What they do say, though, is that resurrection can be seen symbolically, and that it's not an event in the past, but it's an event that happens in this very present moment. It's an enlightenment, right? It is a spiritual vision after which the person having the vision is utterly renewed, has a completely different understanding of the world, has the experience of the living Christ in and around him. You know, uh, I once was lost, but now through this vision, I am found. That's the importance of Jesus' baptism. That's what happens at Jesus' baptism, say the Gnostics. What happens, John puts the water on him, and all of a sudden the heavens open up, and a dove descends from the heavens, and a voice is heard. Now we don't know who heard the voice, but we certainly know that Jesus must have heard it. This is my son with whom I am pleased. Listen to him. Um, that is a vision. That is a kind of resurrection of Jesus. And after this, Jesus goes and teaches, right? So the resurrection precedes death, not death preceding the resurrection. And this is just the bare bones contradictory challenge that the Gnostics bring to the Orthodox. This isn't about having a hallucination. In fact, when it comes right down to it, the vision is the reality, that some people have actually perceived reality as it is. And when we live in this world after having that vision, we we don't feel at home. Back to that Appalachian hymn, that this world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. Um, that's kind of a Gnostic hymn. And also, this world's an illusion. Thus, here's the Platonic philosophy coming in. Uh, think of Plato's cave analogy. All of you people are walking around looking at shadows on the wall, thinking that they're real. And I've emerged from the cave, and I've seen the light. Literally, I've seen the sun. I've seen what causes the shadows, and I'm bringing it back to you guys, and you won't believe me. You still want to hold fast to your shadows on the cave wall, right? That's Gnosticism right there. That this world, not my vision, this world is a hallucination. This world is an illusion. Now, the implications of this are in some ways dire, because some would suggest, this kind of dualism is going to carry its way through Christianity, orthodoxy or not. And it's this idea that this world is a place of lesser value, a place that, like Plato says, keeps our souls chained within us, that this world does not allow us to achieve our true potential, our true spiritual sense of identity. Well, as soon as you start saying something like that, you're devaluing the world around you. And when you add to that apocalyptic ideas where God's going to destroy this world and create a new heaven and a new earth, well, then you've heard the phrase, drive it like a rental. that's what we're going to do with the planet. We're going to drive it like a rental. It's not mine. I got my own car anywhere. My real car is at home, but I'm going to drive this one and take it through. I'm going to take it up into the mountains and well, that's what we do with the planet when we devalue it in this way. So Gnosticism has been uh, charged with this idea that if you take this to its logical conclusion, that this world is not a place that holds any value and therefore you should not take care of it. Add to that this idea that some Gnostics are going to adhere to, not all, but some, that this world is evil. This world is the place that is fighting against your soul that needs to be released from your evil body. Uh, well, you can see, and then add to that, capitalism, in the 18th century, and add to that colonialism, and then you have the perfect formula for the ecological destruction that we are now seeing around us. Climate change and whatnot. Um, I know that's a disputed point for many people, but I happen to believe that climate change is happening. So any I know any comments about that?
Dan, I think the patriarchs of Irenaeus's day seized on mysticism as a way to put the Mary Magdalene story aside and assert their political power within that structure.
Say more about that, Denny, if you would.
Patriarchy was such a overwhelming norm, at that time and has been, right up to maybe 1960s, 70s, that I don't think they were going to stand for, this Mary Magdalene story.
Right, right.
And
Exactly.
mysticism, as opposed to the Gnostics were really almost empiricist, and I think this is one reason, I feel so comfortable with it and it tastes so delicious. And if you can create the mysticism, of the bodily resurrection, ooh, that really sounds pretty special. Ooh,
So it's all manipulation.
oh, Dan. Dan.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but there is a mystical tradition that persists throughout the centuries with people like Meister Eckhart and Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and St. John of the Cross, that is always, calling from the margins. And at times it has given great solace to those highly orthodox um, clerics, right, who are sticking to the orthodox doctrine and dogmas of the church. Uh, but it's been that mystical tradition of achieving oneness with God, which is the Gnostic idea, right? That that has, in times of great stagnation in the church, infused a new kind of spirit of creativity. You might even say that the Reformation can be traced in some ways back to Eckhart, Meister Eckhart, in the 14th, 15th, and 14th and 15th century. Um, uh, Having this understanding that God and I, not God and the church, but God and I have an understanding together. So, and actually there were so-called legitimate forms of Gnostic Christianity. I think some of you know that the monastery that was here in Hastings. I can't remember the name of the monastery, but it's over there where the, medical center is, or
The Croziers.
Crozier.
Crozier.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
Crozier.
Crozier.
Yeah.
And
They were not.
they did work with the ASMAT on the island of New Guinea.
Yeah, yeah. And did you say more about that, Will? Did you go with them at one point, or I think somebody did.
Well, number one, our son Ken, who some of you know, and Angie were in the Peace Corps in Papua New Guinea in the Highlands, and the ASMAT territory was just south of them, not so far. But I took my seventh grade students to the Crozier ASMAT display. Every year I took my seventh graders there.
And Dan,
Interesting. Yeah,
I took my anthropology students there almost every year until they closed the Crozier Order, because that collection was the second best in the country. Only the Rockefeller
right,
collection at the Harvard Peabody Museum was considered to be a finer collection of Osmond art.
right, right. Yeah, in some ways it's a shame that they're gone, but they were a Gnostic Christian group, as I understand it. I don't know too much about them, so um, but this idea of secret teachings, if we think about, what we're saying here is that Christ can be encountered here and now through a mystical vision, not through some sort of line of, descent that goes all the way back to the apostles who witnessed the bodily resurrection. But what do we do with some of the texts in the Bible that talk about Jesus going and let me see if I can find it quickly here, teaching his apostles about the secrets of the kingdom. It's in the Gospel of Mark, it's in the Gospel of Matthew, it's in the Gospel of Luke. It was all the same text that came from Mark, but each Matthew and Luke did their variations on this. Jesus says to his disciples, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn again and be forgiven." I mean, some of this language that even in the Orthodox understanding of the Gospels, some of this language just cannot be denied, right? And this teaching in Gnosticism is a teaching that can continue and continue to be built upon. In the Orthodox tradition, the teaching has to remain stagnant and has to be interpreted with, the finest of tooth combs, right? With legal scholars, with biblical scholars, and creating doctrine and things like this. But the vision of Jesus is a vision that can be had by others and can be creatively added to. Think about what we see in, the Apostle Paul when he talks about in Second Corinthians, he's taken up into the third heaven. And even Paul himself has kind of this Gnostic language, if I can find it here. I'm reading on page 15. Following the crucifixion, they allege that this risen Christ continued to reveal himself to certain disciples, opening to them, we're talking about the Gnostics now, through visions, new insights into divine mysteries. Paul, referring to self obliquely in the third person, says that he was caught up in the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, says Paul. There, in an ecstatic trance, he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Secret things. Through his spiritual communication with Christ, Paul says he discovered hidden mysteries and secret wisdom, which he explains he shares only with those Christians he considers to be mature. but not with everyone. So even Paul himself in First Corinthians, not everybody's getting this teaching. I'm giving to you something that not everybody is worthy of receiving. They're not mature enough. So there is a lot of implication or indications of this kind of secret knowledge throughout Paul's letters, as well as the Gospels themselves. And it was this understanding that what was first given to, let's say, Paul, can be built upon by later and later people. Paul has his teachings that are secret, but then somebody who is a disciple of Paul comes afterwards looking at the foundation of Paul's teachings and then has a vision of Jesus. It's not necessarily a contradiction to what Paul, has taught, but it's something to be added to what Paul has taught. And this was the case of a man by the name of Valentinus. That's the English pronunciation. Valentinus is more the Latin pronunciation, but everybody knows St. Valentine. This was not St. Valentine. This was St. Valentine, I think, was the 4th century. This was a guy that lived in the 2nd century, and he was a leader of Gnostic Christianity. And if I can call it this, it's probably the most conservative type of Gnostic Christianity, because he was still trying to work within in conversation with Orthodox Christians. But he claimed to have had a vision after he had been taught by Paul. And it was on the basis of this vision that he established his church. So it's really interesting what Pagel says on this. And I'm going to see if I can refine this. According to her, the Gnostics are reversing the so-called gospel pattern. Instead of having a historical experience, and that, well, let me read this to you. Followers of Valentinus say that only their own gospels and revelations disclose the secret teachings. These writings tell countless stories about the risen Christ, the spiritual being whom Jesus represented, a figure who fascinated them far more than the merely human Jesus, the obscure rabbi from Nazareth. So they're more interested in the mystical Christ than they are the historical man. For this reason, Gnostic writings often reverse the pattern of New Testament Gospels. Instead of telling the history of Jesus biographically from birth to death, Gnostic accounts begin where the others end, with stories of the spiritual Christ appearing to the disciples. That is the birth of the beginning. So what we get in the Gnostic Gospels then are a lot of stories about these visions. And one place where, you would have a kind of a sense of what this ecstatic vision looked like would have been in the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, where John has a vision. But I think it's really interesting. I looked through all of these art images of John having his vision, and all of them picture John. And remember, these would have been painted in the midst of medieval scholasticism and Orthodox Christianity. This is John on Patmos, but this Hans Memling image that I have on the screen. But he's sitting firmly on a rock, right? And he's looking up into heavens, and the vision is somewhere outside of him, right? He is looking at a vision that is beyond him in another world, but not something that he is experiencing internally. And I was trying to look for representations of what an ecstatic vision might look like, and of course you can't find them. But this is very orthodox, right? John's still firmly based in reality. And he's looking at an image that has been passed on to him by Orthodox Christianity that he reads in the book of Revelation. That's not what the Gnostics were saying. Um, the Gnostics we're going to live in a great contrast, I think, with Orthodoxy, and finally came to the head with Irenaeus in 170 when he established his canon. He needed to establish his canon, and so this is the quote that I read when Mac mentioned his interest in this. This criterion that somehow the four Gospels can trace their authority back to people who were with Jesus and wrote about Jesus just doesn't hold any water anymore. We know that to be the case in the last 50 years, that, the idea that these Gospels, these authoritative texts were written by the actual apostles just doesn't hold water. So I wanted to throw this out before we concluded, but down on my third bullet point here, I've got the word spiritual but not religious. And we often hear that today, right? Oh, in fact, I hear it all the time. I tell people I go to church and I'm more spiritual than religious. Um, I think what we're seeing here, if we're looking at Gnosticism versus the Orthodox, is a flavor of spiritual but not religious. The Orthodox are the religious ones. They're holding to their law, they're holding to their decrees and everything that's so important to maintaining orthodoxy. But Gnosticism allows for the free movement of the spirit. Creativity is important. In fact, that is the authority really that you can appeal to. This is something new I'm bringing. That is a vision that has appeared to me. And there's something that's very appealing about that, because human beings created in the image of God are creators themselves, right? And creativity will continue to perpetuate creativity. It's kind of a yes and idea. The Orthodox Church, however, wants to suppress creativity. It's a yes, but. Now, yeah, you might think that, but you have to keep within the bounds of what we say as a church. Um, and this is where the real problem lies. Creativity, if left untethered, can run amok and will eventually just kind of fizzle out into entropy, where everyone is just their own little creative soul whose creations or visions don't relate to anybody else. There has to be some sort of common denominator that puts all of these creative souls together. And this is my concern about people who are spiritual, right? Um, well, how do you share that spirituality if it's an utterly esoteric internal spirituality? I mean, isn't part of our being alive living in community? And shouldn't there be a community is created by certain bounds, certain shared beliefs and values, right? So there's this balance that we have to hold. The Gnostics are on one end of the teeter-totter, and the ultra-Orthodox, let's call them even fundamentalists, are on the other end of the teeter-totter. And where we have to find ourselves is somewhere at the midpoint, you know, going back and forth throughout history towards, orthodoxy at one point, more creativity at the other. So I understand what the early church fathers were trying to do in a world that was politically falling apart around them, on which they could not rely for any type of, infrastructural, or I should say political support. They were creating their own political support. And the people with the ecstatic visions were threatening that. But the excess of that created community lay in not allowing for any type of creativity. And we know that that is as much a death sentence as anything. So this is a fascinating conversation or a dialogue that's happening in the first and second, or in the second and the third centuries, that will eventually be shut down by the fourth century with Constantine. But this idea of creative invention was a mark of spirituality, is what I'm trying to say. For the Gnostics, being able to create and invent, that was a mark of true spirituality. The Orthodox, not so much, right? So, what do you think about that comparison with spiritual but not religious? Because I think we're seeing a flavor of that in this historical dialogue that we're talking about. Anyone? Maybe that phrase doesn't upset you as much as it does me.
It doesn't, Dan, I don't think people, when they say they're spiritual and not religious, they don't understand the concept of a church.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you say more about that, Mac?
Well, I mean, I've talked to the same people that everybody else does, and they go, "Oh, my church, my religion is in my garden on Sunday mornings, or on the golf course,
Yeah.
or at the lake." Well, okay, but the idea of church and the whole, if you read the Gospels at all, it's community,
Right.
and they
Right.
just don't seem to grasp that importance of that whole idea.
Yeah. I heard Rich Lloyd speak last night, and I'll hear him again this Friday when I go to Kearney for the Flatwater Press gathering that's happening there. But he said something that really struck me, and that is, we live in a world educationally where there's all kinds of information and there's all kind of knowledge out there. And we could sit at home on our computers and do nothing but take classes online and consume information and presumably consume knowledge or develop knowledge out of that. But it's only in community, and this is the point, it's only in community where information and knowledge can become wisdom as we test that information and knowledge against the information and knowledge of others, as the historians, converse with the physicists, as the humanities people converse with the social sciences. That's where information and knowledge become wisdom. And I thought that is a really great way of talking about why a liberal arts institution is so important. The threat that Gnosticism poses is what is more recently been called solipsism, right? The idea that only my experience and only my experience of Christ is legitimate. It can't truly be shared with others. So how do we gather in community to be able to share a common experience? Maybe I'm overstating that issue a little too much because obviously people were doing it. Witness Valentinus, for example. But I find myself drawn to Gnosticism. I'm an introvert. I I like the notion of being able to experience God without that experience being mediated, but I don't like even though I'm an introvert, I don't like the notion of being alone, right? In the world, we were created in the image of God, and the image of God is Trinitarian. God's image is community, therefore, our image, if we're created in the image of God, must also be communal as well. And I think Gnosticism threatens to undermine that. Um, anybody want to, but our time is almost on us. Anybody want to have the last word on this?
Dan, some dear friends of mine are Catholics, and I was just curious if they went to mass on Easter, and they said no. And I said because I'm interested to know, you know, if their priests, were reflecting the message of Pope Leo and
Right.
the top, you know, uh, archbishops, of the Catholic faith.
Right.
And I wonder how many, in all due respect, how many people are listening to our Red Sox fan in the Vatican.
White Sox. White
White Sox,
Sox.
excuse me.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
oh. Yeah, our White Sox fan in the Vatican.
Right. And he's definitely his own man. He's not Francis. But he's definitely got social justice issues foremost in his mind and speaking out. And he doesn't ever name Trump, but it doesn't take much imagination to figure out who he's actually talking about, right? But I mean, this brings the whole issue to bear, doesn't it? Where does our authority lie? And well, there some would say well, it relies both in the church and the state, which should be one, right? But we don't see it that way. And by the way, if you're interested in, I've been talking about this On Point episode yesterday that talked about Christian nationalism, very insightful, and it's available on NPR, On Point on NPR, if you ever want to listen to it. Will, you were going to say something?
Well, environmental stewardship is important to many of us, you and me, for example, and is an expression of God's love. Now, if anyone wants to practice that at 1:30, that's in a half an hour, we're going to meet, Doodle Harris and I and some others are going to meet over at the tree nursery behind the PFF, and we're going to pot up some little blue spruces, little,
Yeah.
and then move them to a smaller nursery because we've outgrown the big nursery.
Oh, great.
And so if anyone wants to, take part in that for a half an hour or an hour, you're more than welcome. I
Thanks,
don't want to
Will.
dig all those holes myself.
But what you're saying about ecological stewardship, that's part of the community as well.
Yes, exactly.
That we are in community with the material world out of which we're made. And I was hoping to get to the end of this chapter today because there's a quote by Jürgen Moltmann that I think Pagels threw in there, didn't throw in there, but concluded with in a very thoughtful way. But we can start with that next time when we come back. So I'll let's begin reading chapter 2, and I'll try to summarize, the conclusion of chapter 1 as we move forward. Um, okay, everyone.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, we'll see you later. Bye.